Welcome to episode 8 of the Chainwheel Diaries podcast. Stories about bike travel told by the travelers themselves. I'm your host, Brian Berlin. Today's episode features an interview with adventure cyclist Kevin O'Leary, who did an epic ride of 2,900 miles from his home in Silver City, New Mexico, to Cancun on the Yucatan Peninsula in Mexico. Kevin documented his trip in journals he published on the Crazy Guy on a Bike website. Great reading for anyone considering long-distance bike travel. In fact, the entire site contains hundreds of bike travel journals. Our listeners will enjoy hearing about Kevin's journey and his approach to bike travel, which I would characterize as more bike exploration. His philosophy is that the journey itself outweighs the destination. Now, on to the show. Well, welcome to the podcast, Kevin. It's great to meet you. Thanks for hopping on today. I've been looking forward to speaking with you since reading your journal. But first, tell us where you are and what you're doing when you're not traveling by bike.
I live in Silver City, New Mexico, which is down in the southwest corner, about 100 miles from the Mexico border. And I'm retired. I've actually been retired for a few years. So I am single. I bought a house about 3 years ago, a fixer-upper place, and it's going to keep me busy the rest of my life.
What were you doing before you retired, Kevin?
I've had a lot of jobs. Probably the most significant one, and maybe the longest one, is I worked for a semiconductor company, chip maker. It was a small Silicon Valley startup. And I initially worked for them as a product engineer, and then I finished up as a design engineer. And that was a pretty good job. I liked it.
So your background is engineering.
Yeah, I did that for maybe 15 years, something like that. But I've done a lot of other things before and since.
Sounds good. So when did you first get into bike travel and what inspired you to do so?
I'll tell you what. I'll go back to when I worked as an engineer. And in 98, I basically left the profession then. And I was in my 40s at that time. Period of about a year, some of my friends and acquaintances died. And I remember one of them distinctly that I visited in the hospital telling me, and he was about my age, I've worked, hard all these years saving up for retirement, and I'm just not going to see it. And he felt bad about it. And it really got me thinking that maybe there's more to life than working 9 to 5. And I did like my job, but I like doing other things too. And I had kind of been on that same track, I'll just stay and work till retirement age. And then that's when I'll go out and I'll have fun and do my traveling and stuff. But anyway, after a lot of thought, I thought, I'm going to take some time off. So anyway, what I ended up doing, Brian, is I had done a bit of hiking prior to then, and I decided I was going to do some serious hiking. So I probably spent a few years doing like long distance trails, like the Appalachian Trail, stuff like that. And then after I had done that for a number of years, I became acquainted with some cyclists. And, after some thought and realizing I could use a lot of the hardware, like tents and cooking gear and sleeping bags that I had used in my hiking, and I could use that in bike touring, I got into bike touring and I was hooked. And I'll just mention one thing that kind of really got me not stuck, but in the groove for bike touring. And that is all the hiking that I did. It was hard on my knees. And I have found that cycling is much easier on my knees. And in a way, I look at cycling as kind of hiking, but you do it at a faster pace. And I still like to do both, but because it's a little less physically demanding, I've spent more time cycling, over the last number of years.
What were some of your first adventures when you started cycling? Where did you go? How did you figure out where to go?
I'll tell you, I was living in Las Vegas at the time, and I was working there, but I had a job where I could take my summers off, and I actually had the ability to take quite a bit of time off. So, I could take off 5 months if I wanted to, and I was doing things like that. So anyway, when I started out, I would head north. I have family in Colorado and in Wyoming. And my first bike trips were basically just going to Colorado and Wyoming and coming back. And I got to tell you, it was a great learning adventure. I remember on my first bicycle trip, I started, I think, in early June. And on my first day out, I knew it was going to be hot, but I hadn't really planned on it getting up to 113 degrees. So I remember I started early in the morning, and I think, around noonish time, I was out, Las Vegas, it's basically a lot of cactus and low brush and stuff like that. There's almost no trees. And I remember finding a culvert under the road and spending a couple hours in the shade in this culvert. So it was a learning experience. But all of my life and all my cycling has been a learning experience. But I hope that answers your question. I basically headed north. And then I expanded beyond that. After just visiting friends and family, then I would do the same, but like when I got up to Wyoming and visited like my father and my brother and stuff, then I started going up in Montana, and then I started going into Idaho and, just expanding my horizons.
And you were self-contained on these trips most of the time. So
Yeah.
true bike packing.
Yeah, I've always, had panniers. And one of the things that I've done, I mentioned I worked as an engineer, and that is probably, the job that I had that paid by far the best. So, and money has never really been that important to me, and I'm a single guy, and I can live frugally. So I tend to look for relatively inexpensive places and modes of travel. So, I'm always looking for camping. When I'm like in the United States or, in Canada or something, I will splurge on a motel room on occasion, but, it's mostly, finding a campground, something to that effect. I
Well,
was also in warm showers, and so I would use warm showers on occasion.
Episode 6, I interviewed a warm showers host that's based in Kutaisi, Georgia, not the southern state, but the post-Soviet country. And he hosts a lot of cyclists during the summer months that are coming from Western Europe and on their way to the Far East. And he had some really great stories. And I'll tell you, I think there's a warm showers host is a friend of the cyclist, but the human kindness that they show is unbelievable.
Yeah, when I was in Las Vegas, I tended to host people, the vast majority of them in the fall. And a surprisingly large number of them were people that were doing North America and South America, starting up in Alaska or Inuvik, I guess, is the town up in Yukon Territory or something in Canada. But anyway, they were going, from the far north to like Tierra del Fuego. a lot of them were young people, and they were Europeans. Most of them were Europeans, and they wanted to go to Las Vegas. So they would, detour and come to Las Vegas.
Oh, I see.
And they would like to stay sometimes for as long as I would let them, because they liked Las Vegas.
Have you ever done any organized tours, or have you mostly just set out on your own?
No, I've always done these things on my own. When I started like the hiking and the cycling, my acquaintances, my friends and family and stuff, these were people that were working and they couldn't get away. So I quickly learned to do these things on my own. And I've always just pretty much been in that mode. So, and it actually works pretty good. I can go at my own pace. I can see some disadvantages, but there's also advantages.
Well, I've interviewed several long distance cyclists, and some like to join up with somebody else, and others like riding solo. I prefer riding solo. I like to be lost in the moment. I like to just listen to the wind in my ears and the voices in my head, and just keep pedaling. I see the advantages of it. Some people prefer to ride in a group. I've done that. That's okay. Even though the group space is out and you're riding by yourself a lot of the time. But a lot of people prefer solo, and I totally get that. So that brings me to your epic adventure from last year when you rode from your home in Silver City, New Mexico, to Cancun on the Yucatan Peninsula in Mexico. But how many miles in total was that trip, and how many days in all did it take you?
I posted a journal, as you know, on Crazy Guy on a Bike on that website. And I would record every day, as I think most cyclists on that website do, your miles. And at the end of it, I looked and it was about 2,900 miles. And when I left Silver City, my plan was to be gone for 3 months. And I left Silver City on November 21st. And coincidentally, I flew home from Cancun February 21st, exactly 3 months. And that was actually a bit of a coincidence. I had hoped to do it in 3 months. And my motivation was I wanted to miss the winter here. The winter isn't bad. Relatively speaking, it's probably pretty mild, but we do get snow and stuff a little bit. But as I mentioned earlier, I got a fixer-up place, and I've got a number of obligations here. And the winter time, it's really about the only time I can get away. So that was kind of how things worked out.
How did you decide on this particular route? How did you plan it out? Uh, daily mileage, the route itself. What kind of tools did you use? Can you talk about that?
Okay, the way I actually chose the route was kind of how I do too many things. I had initially planned to visit a friend of mine that has a place in Puerto Vallarta, and I was going to cycle there. And to digress briefly, I had kind of thought once I had bought my home, which was during COVID days, when I was stuck at home. And then I realized kind of what I got into. Boy, I wonder if my hiking and cycling days are over. And it actually didn't occur to me to go in the middle of winter. And then when my friend invited me to come down to Puerto Vallarta to visit, I got to thinking about it and I realized I can cycle there. But I'll tell you what, I read some journals of people that have cycled in that area, and man, they make it sound like the roads are really difficult in terms of traffic and not having shoulders and stuff like that. And that made me a little bit hesitant to go there. So I begged off going to Puerto Vallarta. I thought I would. And also, I've been along the Pacific coast in that area, and I didn't particularly like it. I'm used to living kind of like in the West in higher elevations where it's cooler. And when I was cycling in Mexico a few years ago, I did go down to the Pacific coast and I cycled there for a few weeks. And I didn't enjoy the heat and humidity. So I retreated to the interior where it was cooler and I enjoyed that more. So anyway, so really what my plan was to go for 3 months. And I had already cycled from Silver City to Durango, and I liked the city of Durango in the state of Durango in Mexico. And so I knew I was going there. And I had also heard a lot of good things about San Luis Potosi. So I thought I would go there, but that's really about as far as I got. And I kind of left things open for what I would do after that. And then as I, traveled down there and thought more about it, um, a friend of mine had a good friend that lived just north of Veracruz, the city of Veracruz in the state of Veracruz. And I was invited to come visit. So I thought, I'll go and do that. And when I got there and looked at kind of like the timing for my 3 month bike tour, and I saw that I could go to Cancun and I could do that in the time frame. And when I had initially left, what my thoughts were to go for 6 weeks, do a U-turn, and basically retrace my route home. And after my 6 weeks were up, I says, I'm not going to do that. And so I had to figure out, well, where am I going to go to? How am I going to get home? And I decided I want to fly home. And I did some research, and so I could fly from Cancun to El Paso, which is relatively close to me. So that things kind of fell into place.
It's an unbelievable route. I'm looking at it. It's the second page in your journal. You covered a lot of ground right through the central part of Mexico and then headed east and down along the Gulf of Mexico. That's a fantastic route. And what were some of the highlights? I've read every page of your journal, and like I said, it's outstanding. A lot of detail, and your reviews of the food, of the accommodations are fantastic. Like I say, I feel like anybody could use this as a roadmap. But what were some of the highlights in this tour that really stick out in your mind?
I'll tell you what, before I directly answer your question, I have done this kind of journal in the past where, I try to give details. And my journals are basically targeted at other cyclists, people that might want to do a similar route. So I try to describe where I'm going to and accommodations, and I mention where I eat and stuff like that. And I got to give a lot of credit to Tim Tower, who's a prolific poster in terms of journals on Crazy Guy on a Bike. Tim's journals are just outstanding, and he presents this information and a lot more. So I've kind of sloppily tried to imitate what Tim has done because I've used Tim's journal to find places to go, Tim's journals to find places to go to and get a really great description of, what's along the way. Okay, with respect to the highlights of my trip, I'll tell you what, for me, the enjoyment is in the journey. I'm not so much into destinations and stuff. I like to cycle. I like to get out every day and, get some fresh air and get on my bicycle. It's always an adventure for me. And that's really the highlight. In all honesty, where I go to is not of huge importance to me. I try to do research so I go to places at the right time, so I'm not in the middle of the desert in the summer, as I've done in the past erroneously. But I just try to pick relatively interesting places. enjoyed was some of the cities along the way, and it kind of relates to my hiking experience. On some of the long distance hikes, you're on the trail for 4 days or something, and then you come to a town. And all the hikers love going to town. You can go and you can get a shower and you can get food and stuff like that. And I have to admit, I'm still in kind of that mode on my bike trips. So I will be out cycling, for a few days. And I cycle, every day. And then I like to take, a couple of days off. And I eat good and I relax and maybe do some things. One of the things that I did on this trip on this bike tour that I enjoyed a lot was going to art museums. I like art. I like to go to art museums, and I went to a number of contemporary art museums, and I enjoyed that a lot. And those tend to be in the larger cities. So with respect to the places I really enjoyed, I would say I really enjoy going to Zacatecas, and which is a pretty good sized city. I really didn't think I would like it that much. And what I liked a lot about it was I stayed in the center of town, and the center is very historical, and they've kept it that way. So, I guess one descriptive term would be quaint. They have cobblestone streets, things like that. Old buildings, they take good care of it. They've got good museums there. It was really a really nice day. I enjoy going to San Luis Potosi too. One of the things I really liked about that was it's very cycling friendly. There's a main freeway that you come into town on. And I came from Zacatecas, and I think it was maybe like 45, Carretera 45. And maybe a dozen miles before you enter the city, and San Luis Potosi is a good sized city. I think it's maybe 1 million, something like that. They have a nice bike path, and it's like right between like the two traffic lanes on the Carretera 45. So you've got, 2 lanes, and then when you get into town, 3 lanes of traffic on both sides of you, and you're going down the center. And that was kind of cool. And there was other things. You get into town, lots of bike paths, lots of cyclists. I enjoyed the place because I ended up staying in a decent hotel. It was a nice hotel. It was cheap. And the location was excellent. And there was a huge mercado close by. And that's one of the things I like about the cities in Mexico, or even the small towns. There's always like at least one mercado. In the small towns, it'll just be one. In the bigger ones, maybe multiple ones. And those are always a lot of fun. There's food there, and there's crafts, and there's interesting people, and they're just fun. I enjoy things like that.
So a lot of the journal entries talk about the roads that you were on, the road surfaces, the shoulders or lack of shoulders that you experienced. Someone reading this would think that you navigated successfully. Somebody considering a trip through Mexico would wonder a couple of things. Like, one, is it safe? Did you feel safe the whole time? And the other is, what kind of shape are the roads in? Do they respect cyclists? Do they have bike paths occasionally? Your journal shows that you did manage to find many bike paths, and I especially like the description of the center lane one, that's a great design. But tell us a little bit about that.
First off, I did feel very safe. I find the people in Mexico to be very friendly, helpful. I think that they're wonderful people. My only regret is my command of Spanish is poor. It would have been nice to engage in conversation with them, but I couldn't do that because of my poor knowledge of the language. But I felt very comfortable cycling there. I will also mention, though, like, as I mentioned earlier, the journey for me is a big deal. So my typical day, I start early in the morning and I'll stop early. Lots of times, around noon or early afternoon. And I like that because then I can do things in the afternoon. And I usually go to bed fairly early. With respect to the roads, there's a couple of rules of thumb for Mexico. They do have some really good, like they call them carreteras, and they're comparable to our interstate highways. There'll be 4-lane divided highways, and usually they're in really good condition, and they'll have shoulders, which is always desirable for cyclists. Also, they tend to be toll roads, but in Mexico, I've never had to pay a toll. The people at the toll booths are really great. And if you can't see a way to go around the toll booth without triggering the sensor, that says that someone has to pay a toll, they'll help you. So the carreteras are really good if you want to make decent time going from point A to point B. Now, there's a lot of bad roads there, but the bad roads, by bad roads, I mean, they're full of potholes. In places, the road will just be tore up. The pavement is gone and you'll be on, rough dirt surfaces and stuff. Those tend to be very secondary roads, very little traffic, and that's out, in the sticks. And it's fun to get on those every once in a while. My bicycle, I have 2-inch wide tires on it. And so, I could go off and, get on dirt or gravel and not have any problems. So that was okay to get on the dirt and the gravel every once in a while. Another kind of rule of thumb in my experience is the worst cycling, in my opinion, tends to be up close to the US border. There's a road called road numbered Highway 2, and it goes east and west across northern Mexico. And I really dread having to cycle on that because it's usually a 2-lane road with no shoulder, and there's a lot of traffic on it and a lot of 18-wheelers. And on my first trip into Mexico, I cycled it, and there's not a lot of roads and towns on Highway 2. And I think I had to go like 100 miles on it, and it was just terrifying. Where I think I had problems cycling in Mexico in the past was people wouldn't see me until they were right on top of me. And, it was problematic for some of them because people, especially in the north, they fly, they really go fast. But anyway, I really don't like cycling close to the border very much. Once you get, 100 miles south of the border or so, it's nice. It's nice. Traffic seems to be a lot mellower, not as much traffic. And in a lot of places in Mexico, especially on the secondary roads, there's not a lot of traffic. And that's fun. You don't need to have a shoulder on the road if there's not much traffic.
Exactly.
You can be very comfortable.
You mentioned that you needed to register when you came into the country, into Mexico, even though you weren't requested to, you figured it might come in handy. Tell us about that.
Mexico, I don't know if you call it a visa as such. It's more informal. But I think kind of the rule of thumb in Mexico is if you want to like walk across the border or drive across the border, and you're only going to be there for a short period of time, and I don't know how to define that, maybe a couple days or maybe 3 days, maybe not even that long, you don't need to do anything. You just walk across the border. However, if you're going to go for a period of time, you need to have, they used to call it a tourist permit, and I can't remember what they call it now, but it's not that important. And when I initially came across the border in November on this tour, they didn't say a word to me. I had my bicycle and panniers and stuff. They didn't say a word to me. One of the guys at immigration talked to me, and that was basically it. And then I just went on through. And after I went on through, I got to thinking, in the past, I've always had to get that tourist card, you know, because they'll ask you for that usually when you leave. And it might be, you probably are going to run into difficulties if you've been there for a while. And, when you get the tourist card, they also put you in the computer. And if they can't find you on the computer or you can't show the card, I'm pretty sure that you'll probably at least have to pay for the tourist card and maybe have to pay a fine or something like that. So if you're going to be there for a period of time, you really want to get the tourist card. When I flew back from Cancun, I had a prepaid for my airline ticket. So I had my bike and my luggage and stuff. And so I go to check in for the flight and I had my passport and I showed it to the ticket agent and she says, I don't see where your passport has been stamped that you entered the country. And I said, oh, I haven't. I didn't fly in and they didn't stamp my passport. And I showed her, I had, the tourist card. And she says, oh, okay, this is fine. She says, but you need to have it stamped by immigration in Mexico before, we can issue you your ticket and take your check-in luggage and stuff. So I had to walk over to immigration. And, the lady there was very nice. I just showed her my tourist card and I showed her that I had paid for it. So to other people, make sure that you save that receipt because when you get the tourist card, you don't pay the people at immigration. They'll direct you to a bank, which is usually adjacent to their office. And the guy at the bank, he will give you a receipt after you pay for it. So you want to save that to show that you've already paid for it, I guess. They always ask for it, both the card and the receipt from the bank.
Looks like we both ride Surly long haul truckers. Yours is a 2013, mine's a 2010. I love that bike. I've done some overnight bike packing with it. It handles luggage really well. Looks to me your setup, you had front and rear panniers. So you were carrying, you must have balanced stuff out, clothing, tools, etc. What was the configuration when you're fully loaded?
I hope I'm answering your question, but the way I try to set things up is, left and right, you try to get roughly equal up front and in the back, like with your panniers. And the other thing that I did was, I noticed early on in my cycling, you put a lot more weight on the rear tire than you do on the front tire. Your rear tires always wear out faster than the fronts. You always get flats in the rear, over the front. So what I do on my tours is I will take my heaviest stuff and I put it in the front panniers. I bring like tools. I bring a few extra parts like chains and, extra brake pads, stuff like that. And when I buy food, especially things that are dense, I put them up front in the front panniers, which are smaller. And then I put lighter stuff in the back. All my clothes, I tried to, and actually, I don't know what the difference is. I would guess that my rear panniers are at least 50% larger in volume in the rear. But when I actually pick up a rear pannier and a front pannier, my front ones are heavier. And I like that. I like that a lot. But I still am putting more weight on the rear. I'll finish with a long tour and, my rear tire has got a lot more wear on it than the front one does. So that's kind of how I try to configure things. On this bike tour, I'll mention that when I'm in Mexico, because I have poor knowledge of the language, and also it seems like people in Mexico, they don't do a lot of camping. There's not many campgrounds. They're pretty rare. So I learned pretty quick and also from other journals, you stay basically in motels along the way. So I figured, well, can I get by without, like a sleeping bag and a tent and stuff? And I could. The route I had selected, um, I wanted to go to a town called Creel, and Creel is at a place called Copper Canyon. Copper Canyon's analogous to our Grand Canyon in the United States, except it's bigger. And I wanted to go there, and there's at least one place where the distance between towns is really long. And I had already done the route before, so I knew this. So I knew I was going to have to camp. So I ended up bringing tent, sleeping bag, cooking gear, all that kind of stuff. But also over the years, given my experience, I try to go really light, which means I try to minimize the number of things I bring. So I've always got room in my panniers. So adding those things was not that big a deal. And even though I try to go light, I'm not a fanatic about it. So, I do try to do it, but if I bring heavy stuff, I kind of weigh, the value it has versus how much it weighs and the volume of it, and is it worth it? And I guess given my experience, I judge whether, these things have value or not. Now, one of the things I did, which is probably a bit unusual, is I chose not to bring my cell phone. I brought instead a small netbook computer, and I basically did that because I didn't want to bring both. So it was a question of which one will I bring. And I have a lot more experience with the computer, and I feel more comfortable with the computer. And also I was doing a journal daily, so I did a lot of typing, and I don't like typing on the phones. So it was pretty easy. But that's like an example. I think probably almost everyone brings a cell phone. Some bring both a laptop and a cell phone. I chose just to bring the computer. So,
But you were able to stay in touch with anybody that you needed to. I remember reading that, sometimes in the evenings you were answering emails. Wi-Fi was spotty from time to time, but for the most part, you weren't off the grid. You were able to communicate and you were able to upload your journal. So not having your cell phone didn't seem like a disadvantage at all.
well, I'll tell you, Brian, if I could just back you up 1 second, I actually did run into one problem that was significant. One place that a cell phone would be very handy is like if you want to make a reservation for a motel room.
Right.
Okay. Almost invariably they want a phone number.
Yeah.
Lots of times it's impossible almost to make a reservation for accommodations lacking a cell phone. So that became problematic on a couple of occasions. Normally, when I was cycling, I didn't need a reservation. Very rarely would I go to a hotel and they were booked up. But at the end of the tour, especially like around Cancun, they were busy, and I did run into some problems there. It would have been good at the very end of my trip to have that cell phone and to make a reservation in advance.
Well, it sounds like you're more of an explorer than a bike tourer, because, like you say, the ride itself is the adventure and the destination is less so. And I think that's well said. I follow some others on the internet that also set out in a country and just travel around by bike. They don't necessarily design a route. They ask locals for directions and they're exploring, real adventurous. And reading your journal, I think you have some of that adventure in you, as far as how you look at cycling tours and also hiking tours.
Brian, I'll tell you what, something that popped into my mind is when I wrote my journal on my tour, there's like a guest book option in there, and people could send you a message. And I got a message from someone that was reading my journal, and it was another senior like myself. And what they have been doing, I think they said for the last decade, is going to Southeast Asia. And they were saying, in the middle of winter, Southeast Asia, I'm thinking it's places like Thailand, um, maybe Vietnam and Cambodia, places like that. They said the weather is really nice. And that's where they were off to. And I got to thinking, there's not a lot of places to go in the middle of winter, but Southeast Asia may be one. So I think on my next bike tour, which would probably be again in the middle of winter, I'm going to look at Southeast Asia. Never been there before. I don't know if Taiwan qualifies. When I worked as an engineer, I did make a business trip to Taiwan, but that was like business. But a cycling trip to Southeast Asia, that might be a lot of fun.
There are journals on Crazy Guy on a Bike of people doing those tours in Southeast Asia. And yes, they're raving about it. One of my interviewees rode on an organized tour in Vietnam, said it was fantastic. So I agree with everything you're saying. And it's bicycle friendly, it's cyclist friendly. They're great routes. There's a lot to see. There's history. And definitely, I think on a lot of people's bucket list, I've got it on mine. Sounds like you might add it to yours.
Correct.
All right. Well, Kevin, this has been fantastic. I've learned a lot from listening to you, in addition to reading your journal. And again, I want to thank you for coming on the podcast and telling about your cycling adventures. And I will tell the listeners, check out Kevin's journal, Winter in New Mexico. It's on crazyguyonabike.com. It's great reading. There are great pictures. It's an excellent roadmap. And reading this journal, I think you could get on your bike, load it up, and follow the same path. And I hope that some of the listeners actually do that. So thank you very much again, Kevin. It was wonderful to meet you.
Well, Brian, thank you so much. I've enjoyed chatting with you. It's always wonderful to talk to other touring cyclists. I think you do a great thing. I don't think there's enough, podcasts out there. And, you can't say anything but good things about people getting out on their bikes. So if I can motivate, my adventures motivate one or other two people to get out there on their bikes, I'll be very happy. So thank you for your kind words. I appreciate that, Brian. Been great chatting with you.
Same here. And maybe our paths will cross again. I hope they do. And best wishes to you going forward.
Same to you, Brian. Keep the what do they say? Keep the shiny side up.
Keep the shiny side up. That's a good note to part ways on. Thank you once again.